32 years of marriage ended with a single sentence over breakfast, and her husband had no idea what was coming next. Margaret Collins was 58 years old when she learned that 32 years of loyalty could be erased in the time it takes to pour a cup of coffee. She was standing at her kitchen counter on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that had repeated itself thousands of times before, when her husband looked up from his plate and told her, in the same tone he might have used to mention the weather, that he was in love with someone else. He did not raise his voice. He did not look away. And in that single, quiet moment, the life Margaret had spent 3 decades building began to come apart in ways she could not yet imagine. What she did not know that morning, what none of them could have known, was that somewhere across town, an 84-year-old woman named Eleanor Collins had already been watching this unraveling for longer than anyone realized, and had already decided that the story would not end the way her son believed it would. Before we dive deeper, welcome back to Scars and Stories. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how a marriage that had survived so much could collapse in a single conversation, you have to understand what Margaret and Robert Collins had actually built together. They met in their 20s, in a small Ohio town where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business, and married within 2 years, certain in the particular way that young people are certain that they had found something that would last. Robert wanted to build things, literally, and within a few years of their wedding, he started a small construction company with nothing more than a used truck, a handful of tools, and the kind of confidence that either builds an empire or bankrupts a family. Margaret was the one who kept it from being the second thing. She managed the books at the kitchen table after their children were asleep. She answered calls from frustrated clients when Robert was too proud to apologize. And when a corporate job offered her a promotion that would have doubled her salary, she turned it down without much hesitation, because someone needed to hold the business and the household together, and in her mind, that someone was her. The sacrifices did not stop there. When Robert's father died unexpectedly, it was Margaret who stepped in to help care for his aging mother, Eleanor, a woman known throughout the community for being sharp, private, and not particularly easy to get close to. Most people who met Eleanor described her as guarded, a woman who had learned a long time ago not to hand her trust to just anyone. But somewhere in the quiet, unglamorous work of driving her to doctor's appointments, sitting with her through recovery after a hip surgery, and simply showing up on ordinary afternoons when no one asked her to, Margaret earned something from Eleanor that even Robert had never fully earned, which was her genuine respect. Eleanor rarely said so outright, but there were moments, small and easy to miss, where her affection for her daughter-in-law slipped through. Once, watching Margaret patiently balance the household accounts at the kitchen table, Eleanor asked her, almost offhandedly, whether Robert had ever really talked to her about the future, about what he wanted for the years ahead. Margaret laughed it off at the time. She had no idea how much weight that single question would carry years later. There was also the vacation house, a modest lake property that Margaret had helped pay for using money she had saved quietly over the years from a part-time bookkeeping job she never gave up, even while running the household and helping manage Robert's growing company. It was never a grand estate, just a small house with a dock and a view she loved, but it represented something to her that went beyond its market value. It was proof, in her mind, that she had built something of her own inside the marriage, something tangible that belonged to both of them because of choices she had made. For years, that house held nothing but good memories, family barbecues, her children learning to swim off that same dock, quiet mornings with coffee, and a view of the water that made all the years of sacrifice feel worth it. Underneath the surface of what looked like a stable marriage, though, there were small inconsistencies that Margaret either did not notice or chose not to examine too closely, which is often how these stories begin. Robert had grown more distant over the last several years, quieter in a way that felt less like contentment and more like distraction. He worked later than the business seemed to require. He became oddly formal about certain financial paperwork, insisting on handling some of it himself, when for years Margaret had always been the one to manage those details. None of these things seemed significant enough on their own to raise alarm. It is only in hindsight, once the full picture comes into focus, that people tend to realize how many quiet warnings they walked past without ever slowing down to look at them directly. Their two children, Sarah and Michael, grew up inside this life without ever fully understanding how much of it had been held together by their mother's invisible labor. Sarah, the elder of the two, had always been close to her father, admiring his confidence and the way he seemed to command a room without ever raising his voice. Michael, more reserved, had spent his childhood trying to earn Robert's approval in 100 small ways, something that shaped how quickly he would later choose a side when a side needed to be chosen. Neither of them saw their mother's contributions as anything extraordinary, because to them, it had simply always been there, the same way the walls of the house had always been there, unremarkable until the day they were gone. The morning that changed everything began like any other. Margaret was making coffee, Robert was reading something on his phone at the table, and the house held the same unremarkable quiet it always did on a weekday morning. When Robert finally spoke, he did not raise the subject gently, and he did not seem to feel the need to. He told her plainly that he had fallen in love with someone else, that he had already made his decision, and that he intended to leave. Margaret's first instinct was disbelief, the kind that makes a person ask the same question twice, because the answer feels too large to accept the first time. But Robert did not waver, and within that same conversation, he revealed something that turned her disbelief into something closer to devastation. He had already moved the other woman into the vacation house, the same house Margaret had helped pay for out of her own savings. The same house that held 30 years of her family's memories. It was not simply that he was leaving. It was that he had already begun building a new life inside the walls of the one she had helped create. The woman's name was Vanessa Hale, and in the weeks that followed, Margaret would learn only fragments about her, enough to form an outline but not enough to understand who she truly was. Vanessa was in her mid-40s, attractive in an effortless way, and possessed a kind of easy charm that made people want to like her before they had any real reason to. Robert described her, when pressed, as someone who made him feel young again, someone who listened to him in a way he claimed Margaret no longer did. Margaret would spend months turning that accusation over in her mind, wondering how much of it was true, and how much of it was simply the kind of story people tell themselves to justify choices they have already made. What made the following weeks unbearable for Margaret was not only the betrayal itself, but the reaction of the two people she least expected to lose. When Sarah and Michael learned that their father was leaving their mother for another woman, Margaret assumed, the way any parent would assume, that her children would stand beside her. Instead, both of them sided with their father almost immediately. Sarah told her mother, in a conversation Margaret would replay in her mind for years afterward, that she was, in Sarah's words, too old to start over anyway, and that maybe it was simply time for her to accept that this chapter of her life was over. Michael said less, but his silence and his continued closeness with Robert said enough. Within a matter of weeks, Margaret found herself without a husband, without the loyalty of her own children, and soon, without even the home and business shares she had spent 3 decades helping to build. Robert's lawyers moved quickly, restructuring the ownership of the construction company in ways Margaret did not fully understand at the time, and by the end of that first month, she had lost nearly everything she believed belonged to her. There was, however, one person who had been paying far closer attention to all of this than anyone realized, and that person was Alina. In the months leading up to Robert's announcement, and in the weeks that followed it, Alina said very little to anyone about what she thought of her son's decision. She attended a few tense family gatherings, watched Vanessa carefully during the brief moments they interacted, and continued to invite Margaret to visit her, quietly, without ever making a show of it. What no one in the family knew, not Robert, not Sarah, not Michael, and not even Margaret herself, was that Alina had already begun making inquiries of her own. She had noticed things about Vanessa that unsettled her, small details in the way Vanessa asked questions about the family's finances, about Alina's own health, about the value of the company Robert had built. Alina was not a woman who acted on suspicion alone, but she was also not a woman who ignored a feeling once it had settled into her chest and refused to leave. As the weeks turned into months, Margaret began rebuilding a life from what felt like nothing, moving into a small apartment across town and taking whatever comfort she could find in the fact that she still had her health and her independence, even if very little else remained intact. It was during this period that she began noticing something strange about the way Vanessa carried herself around the family, something that did not quite fit the story of a woman who had simply fallen in love with Robert. In conversations Margaret happened to overhear or was told about secondhand, Vanessa seemed far more curious about Aliner's health and Aliner's finances than she ever seemed about Robert as a person. She asked pointed questions about the family's assets during a holiday gathering Margaret was no longer invited to but heard about from a cousin. She inquired, more than once, about how the construction company was structured and who technically held ownership. At the time, these details seemed like nothing more than the natural curiosity of someone marrying into money. Margaret would only later understand how wrong that assumption was. Sarah, meanwhile, was beginning to experience a kind of quiet unraveling of her own, when she was too proud and too ashamed to admit to anyone, least of all her mother. In the months after choosing her father's side so quickly, Sarah began to notice things about Vanessa that troubled her, small inconsistencies in the stories Vanessa told about her own past, a certain coldness that appeared whenever the conversation moved away from money or status. Sarah found herself picking up the phone to call her mother more than once, only to hang up before it rang, unable to find the words to admit that she might have made the wrong choice. She told herself she was simply too busy, too consumed with her own life, but the truth was closer to shame, the particular kind of shame that comes from realizing you abandoned someone who never deserved to be abandoned. Aliner's health began to decline more noticeably around this time, and as it did, she spent increasingly more of her remaining energy with Margaret rather than with her own son. She never explained this shift to anyone, and no one in the family thought to question an elderly woman's right to choose how she spent her final months. What they did not know was that Aliner had quietly hired a private investigator almost a year earlier, a discreet man recommended to her by an old friend, and had asked him to look into two things specifically: the background of the woman her son intended to marry, and the recent changes made to the ownership structure of the family construction company. Aliner kept the findings in a locked drawer in her study, along with a growing collection of handwritten letters she had begun writing months before her diagnosis worsened. Letters she instructed her lawyer, a careful and old-fashioned man named Mr. Whitfield, not to open until after her death. The full weight of what Aliner had discovered did not surface until after her passing, but the early signs of it began appearing even before then, in ways that unsettled Robert without his fully understanding why. He noticed his mother growing more distant toward him, more pointed in her questions during their infrequent conversations, more interested, suddenly, in reviewing old paperwork related to the company he believed he had built entirely on his own. Robert, confident as always in his own version of events, assumed his mother's coolness was simply grief over the divorce, or perhaps disapproval of Vanessa's age relative to his own. He did not consider, even for a moment, that his mother might already know more than he did about the woman he had chosen to build a new life around. It was Margaret, in the months following her divorce, who stumbled upon the first piece of evidence that would eventually unravel the entire story. While sorting through old boxes of financial documents that Robert's lawyers had returned to her as part of the separation, she found a manila folder containing draft divorce papers, papers that had clearly been prepared years earlier, long before Robert had ever confessed to an affair. The date on the documents placed their creation nearly 4 years before that Tuesday morning breakfast, back when Margaret had still believed, without question, that their marriage was solid. The realization that settled over her in that moment was different from the pain of the initial betrayal. This was not a man who had fallen unexpectedly into an affair and made an impulsive decision. This was a man who had been planning his exit for years, quietly preparing the paperwork of an ending long before he ever gave his wife the chance to understand what was happening to her own life. Margaret sat with those papers for a long time before she showed them to anyone, turning over years of memories in her mind, and searching for the moments she must have missed, the signs she had been too trusting or too busy to notice. She thought about the late nights at the office that she had never questioned, the sudden interest Robert had taken in handling certain financial matters himself, the small formalities that had crept into their relationship without her ever asking why. None of it had seemed significant in isolation. Together, it painted the picture of a marriage that had been quietly ending for years, while she continued showing up to build a life she did not know was already being dismantled behind her back. Eleanor passed away not long after Margaret made this discovery, and the family gathered for a funeral that felt, to almost everyone present, more tense than grief-filled. Robert stood beside Vanessa. Sarah stood somewhere between her parents both physically and emotionally, and Michael remained close to his father, still unaware of how much was about to change. Margaret attended quietly, seated toward the back, uncertain of her place in a family that had made it clear months earlier that she no longer belonged. What none of them anticipated was how quickly the family would be summoned back together, not for grief, but for the reading of Eleanor's will. Mr. Whitfield requested that the entire family gather in his office the week following the funeral, a request that struck most of them as unusually formal for a woman whose estate they assumed would simply be divided in predictable fashion between her only son and, presumably, her grandchildren. Robert arrived confident, almost impatient, clearly expecting the reading to be little more than a formality on the way to inheriting the wealth he had always assumed would eventually be his. Vanessa arrived beside him, dressed carefully, watching the room with an attentiveness that, in hindsight, revealed far more about her intentions than anyone recognized at the time. Margaret arrived without expectation, having been invited only because Eleanor had specifically named her in the instructions left with the will. Mr. Whitfield began not with the distribution of assets, but with an explanation. He told the family that Eleanor had spent the final 2 years of her life growing increasingly concerned about patterns she had observed within her own family, patterns of loyalty, of dishonesty, and of the quiet ways people reveal who they truly are when they believe no one important is watching. She had, he explained, hired a private investigator to look into certain matters, and had spent months compiling her findings into a series of letters she wanted read aloud, in full, before any inheritance was discussed. The room grew noticeably tense at this announcement, and it was in this moment that Robert's confident posture began, for the first time, to falter. The first letter revealed what Eleanor's investigator had uncovered about Vanessa Hale, and it was not the story of a woman who had simply fallen in love with a wealthy, successful man. According to the investigator's findings, Vanessa had a documented pattern of forming relationships with wealthy men whose families held significant assets, relationships that consistently ended once the financial opportunities within them were exhausted or blocked. Robert had not been chosen for who he was as a person. He had been chosen because he represented the most accessible path to the far larger fortune that belonged to his mother. Eleanor's letter stated plainly that she believed Vanessa's real interest had never been in her son at all, but in the estate she stood to inherit from Eleanor herself, an estate Vanessa likely assumed Robert would eventually control without question. The second letter addressed the divorce papers Margaret had already discovered on her own, confirming what Margaret feared but had not wanted to fully accept. Eleanor had known, through her own quiet observations and conversations with Robert over the years, that her son had been unhappy and quietly planning his exit from the marriage long before Vanessa ever entered the picture. Eleanor did not excuse this decision, but she made clear in her letter that what troubled her far more than the affair itself was the manner in which Robert had chosen to end his marriage, allowing years to pass while Margaret continued sacrificing for a future he had already privately decided would not include her. The third letter turned to Sarah and Michael, and this was the moment that broke something open in Sarah that she had been holding closed for months. Eleanor wrote that she had watched her grandchildren choose convenience and comfort over their own mother, dismissing 32 years of sacrifice with a cruelty she found difficult to forgive, even as she loved them both deeply. She wrote, specifically, that she hoped one day they would understand the cost of what they had done, not as a punishment, but as a lesson she would not live long enough to teach them in person. Sarah, sitting beside her brother, began crying in a way she had not allowed herself to since the divorce began, finally releasing months of quiet regret she had been too ashamed to speak aloud. It was only after all of the letters had been read that Mr. Whitfield moved on to the actual distribution of the estate, and what followed left the entire room in stunned silence. Eleanor's will stated, in language that left no room for interpretation, that her son Robert would receive exactly $1 from her estate. The remainder of her multi-million-dollar fortune, including significant real estate holdings and investments accumulated over decades, would go entirely to Margaret. Robert sat frozen as Mr. Whitfield read the figures aloud, his confidence from earlier in the meeting completely gone, replaced by a disbelief that mirrored in its own way. The disbelief Margaret had felt on that Tuesday morning, nearly a year earlier. There was one final piece of information Mr. Whitfield had been instructed to share, one that would prove even more devastating to Robert than the will itself. Years earlier, during a period when Robert had been restructuring the ownership documents of the construction company, he had signed a series of papers that he believed were routine administrative filings, papers he had not read carefully because he trusted the process implicitly. Those documents, it turned out, had granted Margaret controlling ownership of the company, a detail that had gone unnoticed for years because no one had ever had a reason to challenge it. The business Robert had spent his adult life believing was entirely his own had, in fact, legally belonged to Margaret the entire time. Everything he had used to justify his sense of independence, his confidence in leaving, had been standing on ground that was never actually his to stand on. In the weeks that followed the will reading, Margaret found herself facing a decision that surprised even her, one that would ultimately define the rest of her story more than anything Robert or Vanessa had done to her. She did not want revenge, though she certainly could have pursued it, given everything the law and the will now placed in her hands. Instead, she reached out to Robert privately, away from lawyers and family gatherings, and offered him something she was not required to offer at all, a genuine opportunity to acknowledge what he had done, to take responsibility, and to begin, in whatever limited way might still be possible, rebuilding some version of trust with the family he had so carelessly discarded. Robert, still unable to see past his own wounded pride, refused. He accused Margaret of trying to humiliate him, of using his mother's estate to punish him for choices he still believed, even then, he had every right to make. It was only after that refusal that Margaret made her final decisions. She sold the construction company that had legally belonged to her all along, using a portion of the proceeds, along with a portion of Eleanor's estate, to establish a fund in Eleanor's name supporting a local charity her mother-in-law had quietly supported for years without ever telling anyone. She helped Sarah, who had finally found the courage to apologize fully and mean it, rebuild a relationship with her that would take years to fully repair but had, at last, genuinely begun. She kept her distance from Michael for a while longer, understanding that some repairs take more time than others, and unlike Robert, she did not close that door completely. And in a quiet, unplanned turn that felt less like fate and more like simple coincidence, she reconnected with an old college friend she had lost touch with decades earlier. A connection that slowly, gently, became the beginning of a new chapter she had never expected to have the chance to write. Robert, in the end, lost almost everything, not because Margaret took it from him out of spite, but because of the consequences of choices he had made years before anyone else even knew he was making them. He lost the business he thought was his, the inheritance he assumed was guaranteed, and the family that had once, however imperfectly, been built around him. Vanessa, once it became clear there was no fortune left to access, disappeared from his life almost as quickly as she had entered it, leaving him with the $1 his mother had left him, a sum that felt, to everyone who eventually heard the full story, less like an insult and more like a final, quiet lesson about what a life built on dishonesty ultimately amounts to. Margaret Collins did not set out to win anything. She simply refused to disappear quietly from a life she had spent 32 years helping to build. Eleanor did not leave her daughter-in-law a fortune to punish her own son. She left it because she had spent years watching closely enough to know exactly who deserved to be protected, and who had already, through years of quiet choices, decided to walk away from everything that mattered. If this story stayed with you, you are not alone. These are the kinds of stories that remind us that the truth has a way of surfacing eventually, no matter how carefully it has been buried, and that the people who see us most clearly are not always the ones we expect. If you have ever been shown more loyalty by someone else's family than by your own, or if you have ever watched someone finally face the consequences of choices they thought they had gotten away with, tell us about it in the comments below. And if this story is one you will still be thinking about tomorrow, go ahead and subscribe to Scars and Stories, where we tell the moments that break us and the moments that quietly, patiently put us back together again.